My name is Richard Cohen. I'm the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm here in Montgomery, Alabama. And my name is Richard Cohen. I'm the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. All right. Well, we're back. We're back. Proving again that I can't do this alone. My colleagues and I have really been reeling since the events in Charlottesville earlier this month. I mean, it's quite incredibly tragic. We saw the loss of life, Heather Heyer, a wonderful woman, many people injured. And really, it was the largest white supremacist gathering we had seen in our memory. And I think it said something very disturbing about the direction of our country. What prompted the rally was a protest against a decision of the city of Charlottesville to move a monument to Robert E. Lee from a public park. And, we've seen these kinds of controversies around the country, most recently before Charlottesville in New Orleans. And I think we're likely to see many more of them going forward. And that's why I'm really pleased today to have as our special guest, Garrett Epps. Garrett is a professor of law at the University of Baltimore. He's a journalist, a distinguished journalist. He is a novelist. He is, I think, what one would call nowadays a public intellectual. He's also, like me, someone from Richmond, Virginia, born and bred in Richmond, Virginia, the second capital of the Confederacy. So, and I should also add that, Garrett is a couple years older than me, just a couple. And so we didn't know each other growing up in Richmond. But my mother had the pleasure of working for his father, A.C. Epps, who was a great, great lawyer, and someone who also wrote a recommendation for me to go to the University of Virginia School of Law. So, Garrett, I always appreciated that. Thank you so much.
My mother was a legend at our house, too, because she was the person who kept my dad from going off the rails, and we all knew it. So.
Yeah, she did the same thing for me. I really, really, really appreciate your being here today.
I'm delighted.
Garrett, when I think about Richmond, our hometown, the second capital of the Confederacy, I think at some point it's likely to be ground zero of this, of the controversy surrounding the Confederate monuments. To quote Saddam Hussein, it may be the mother of all battles when it comes to this. Garrett, for the people who don't know Richmond, tell everyone a little bit about Monument Avenue, if you would.
Well, Richard, thank you for having me here, and I'm delighted to talk about this topic because I literally, and quite literally, grew up in the shadow of that Lee Monument, just a block away on Park Avenue. But Monument Avenue, for those of you who haven't been to Richmond, really is one of the most extraordinarily beautiful urban boulevards in the U.S. and arguably in the world. It's a 4-lane street with a tree-planted median, and it's made out of Belgian block. It's not made out of asphalt. There was about 30, 40 years ago, the city tried to put asphalt.
Hey, Garrett, let me give me a favor. Speak up just a little bit.
All right. About 30, 40 years ago, the city tried to put asphalt over the block, and the grand dames of Virginia society came out and literally lay down in front of the asphalt machines. So we still have this beautiful Belgian block. It makes a distinctive sound when you drive over it. And as you drive west from downtown, you begin to encounter these that have monumental Confederate statues in them. You start with Jeb Stuart, then you go about 10 blocks further and you come to Robert E. Lee, then Stonewall Jackson, then you come to a monument for Matthew Fontaine Maury, who is a guy of such well-deserved obscurity that when I was a kid, I could not possibly remember. I was told over and over who he was, and I kept forgetting. And then finally to a monument to what we called President Davis, which includes a huge obelisk that is intended to evoke the memory of the Washington Monument. And the overwhelming, there was no other statuary on the street as we grew up, and it meant that the kind of heart of the city, day after day, passed through what was really a kind of, cenotaph. It was a kind of cemetery of the Confederate great. The Lee statue, as you pointed out to me, is a 14-foot equestrian statue on a 45-foot plinth. So it's not just that there's a statue there. It dominates that entire urban space, which is ringed by dwellings and apartment houses and some schools.
When were these statues built, Garrett?
Well, the Lee statue was the first to go up, as I reconstruct it, and that was in 1890. In 1890, I think not by coincidence, was the year that the first Southern state imposed a new constitution that basically said Black people could no longer vote. That was South Carolina. So you can see this is a period when segregation, as we knew it when we were younger, was being put in place. Segregation had not really been created until the 1890s. The Lee statue, as I recall, went up in 1905, and about the same time the Jackson statue, and then the Davis statue was last. And when I was young, I had my father had a picture of his mother and my Aunt Clara at the dedication of the Davis Monument. Two little tiny Southern ladies in the biggest damn hats you ever saw. So it was all fairly recent. It was not actually from the war period. And these were, historians say, these are monuments to the triumph of a certain political faction in the South that came to power starting in about 1890 and continued on until we reach, the 1920s, which are called the nadir, the low point of American race relations. And they went on changing the urban landscape of the South to ensconce at the center of Southern civic life this image of the lost cause, this image of the Confederacy, and this image of people like General Lee, who you know as well as I do from growing up in Richmond, we were taught was one of the greatest men who ever lived, that he was a person of sterling character. We were told over and over, General Lee didn't support slavery. He thought slavery was terrible, but he had to fight for Virginia because it was a matter of honor. And he never lied. It was kind of the George Washington of the South. And this, of course, is a completely post hoc historical creation. Lee was, a pretty good general. He, if you don't count Gettysburg, he was a pretty good general. But of course, at Gettysburg, he did lose the war. He owned slaves, he bought slaves, he sold slaves, he lived off the labor of slaves.
And he was cruel to them, as I understand it, quite cruel.
He had them beaten if they ran away or defied his authority, which I think that's what slavery entails, right? In other words, I think the idea that there were slave owners who were kind and good to the slaves and the slaves loved them, I think historically that's a kind of a hard contention to maintain. He was part and parcel of the institution of slavery, and to have turned him into this icon, into this center, social center. And I can tell you some anecdotes, if you like, about the degree to which people revered this man, while during even my adult life. It is a brilliant piece of propaganda, because whether intentionally or not, the human mind cannot keep these two beliefs together. Belief one, Black people are equal human beings and citizens with me. That's belief one. Belief two, General Lee was the greatest man who ever lived. Those two beliefs cannot coexist in one brain. The cognitive dissonance is too much. And so there was this constant thing of how, the Confederacy, yes, it's really a shame about slavery. We're all glad it's over. But, they were good for their time and they were trying to do their best. And Confederate values were passed along so overtly through this civic symbolism and this civic mythology of the great Lee, the great Jackson. I mean, if you read about Stonewall Jackson was a pretty good general, but if you read about him as a human being, he was kind of scary. He was kind of like Hannibal Lecter. I mean, his thing was, let's go kill people, and then they would do that. These are not really the people that, if you want an equal and just and prosperous and peaceful society, you don't organize it around people whose function was to facilitate the deaths of so many people in order to protect the institution of slavery.
Yeah. Garrett, speak for a moment about the myth of the lost cause for people who aren't familiar with that term.
Well, the lost cause was began to be put in place as early as 1868, but it reached began to reach its peak in the generation after the Civil War generation. And one of the things I've read recently in the historiography that's fascinating is that the period of the lost cause and the period of segregation really began about the time you began to have a generation of free Black Southerners who had never been slaves. And white society found this quite scary. They thought, what's this going to be like? And they began to kind of try to integrate why why Black people should be subordinate and so forth. And the lost cause basically said a couple of things. One was that the Civil War was not about slavery. And you can, as well as I do, you still run people today will tell you, Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. Under the lost cause, they said, that the South was treated slaves well, and they would have freed their slaves on their own. That what made the problem was abolitionists came down, they stirred up violence, and they stirred up problems, and then finally the South, had to defend states' rights and left. And if the South had left to itself, it would have worked out these problems, and we would. The colored people would live peacefully among us, and there wouldn't be any problem. And the problem is the North. The problem is Northern aggression. The problem was Lincoln and people like him. And Lincoln was the tyrant. That's what we were taught. And the problem today, and this is like the 40s and 50s and 60s. The problem today was Northerners who were coming down here and trying to upset things for their own personal gain. So this is a very powerful mythology. It absolves white people, of what really is a fairly heavy burden to carry around. Being a slave master, but no one likes to think of themselves that way. And it turned out that slavery was pretty benign. That everybody was kind of in it together, and that things have gotten worse. Things have gotten much worse since emancipation.
Was this part of it too? I remember on the right-hand plank of Jefferson Davis's statue, I'll never forget it, it says 4 years of unflinching struggle against overwhelming odds.
Well,
the notion of heroism.
Yeah, well, the three things that are essential to understand there are, first of all, honor, that the South was fighting for honor. And that, of course, was the central myth about Lee, was that, because he had to honor his state, he fought reluctantly against the United States. And that this myth of the Confederacy as this peculiarly honorable institution, persists to this day. The other thing is that the only reason the South lost, and we were explicitly taught this in school and by people we knew, the only reason the South lost was that Lincoln flung open the gates of the seaport and brought the scum of Europe to the United States and put them in the army and sent them south. So that, I have in front of me, as a matter of fact, in honor of this occasion, General Lee's General Order Number 9, which is called Lee's Farewell to the Troops. And the first line of it was he says, after 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. So the idea was we didn't lose. They cheated. They brought in all these people from Europe, and Of course, we didn't learn that there had been black troops, but that was part of it originally. We were just outnumbered. We were crushed. We were the better soldiers. We fought better. We had more honor. The Northerners were beasts. General Butler was the military governor in Richmond when Richmond was part of military district number 2. And I grew up hearing stories about how my great grandmother had gone to General Butler and waved her umbrella at him and said, "You have that man give me my horse back." And apparently General Butler tipped his hat and restored her horse to her. But we were taught to call him Beast Butler, Ben the Beast Butler, that he was, this vile kind of scum, carpetbagger out of Birth of a Nation, who had come south to degrade the South and humiliate the South and grind their faces in the dust. And so all of this is all gathered together. The South was honorable. The South didn't really lose. It wasn't fighting for slavery. We are the victims. And of course, as you know from your work better than I do, there's this constant grapple to when you, particularly if you are in an oppressive situation and you are enjoying unearned privilege, the psychic defense to that is to say, no, I'm the victim. I'm being the victim. And Confederate, even at the time of the Confederacy, they said slavery is much worse. This is something Lee wrote. Slavery is much worse for white people than for black people. We have the burden of, taking care of all our slaves and so forth. And this mentality is just extended right into my generation.
Yeah, why today, 100 years after some of these statues went up, are people still clinging to them? And why is that? What do they represent to people today?
Well, I think that at the time that they went up, they were not historical commemorations. They were a political program. That's what we talked about earlier, right? Starting in 1890, we are remaking the South into this segregated racial dictatorship. And these monuments are the ones that stand for it. I don't know, this is a little bit of a segue, but I spent some time in Uzbekistan a few years ago. Absolutely fascinating, marvelous place that regrettably has an authoritarian government. And the dictator at that time, a man named Islam Karimov, had gone all over the country and built statues to Tamerlane, Emir Timur, we call Tamerlane, the conqueror, who came out of Europe and burned Baghdad and so forth, who was, from Uzbekistan. And the idea was, with the collapse of communism, we have to give people something to worship. And we're going to take this figure who's an authoritarian and a conqueror and make him the key to our civic life. And very much the same kind of calculation, goes into this.
Why now? What prompted the, suddenly the uproar about these monuments? They've been there in Richmond, all over the South, other places for generations. What happened?
Well, it's fascinating. Somebody once said to me that social change is kind of like a nice warm bath, in the sense that you're sitting in the bathtub and you're humming away and you're, reading or whatever, and the bathtub starts to drain, and you don't notice it until all of a sudden, right? That the last minute, all the water just goes out. And at this moment now, when I look back on, my life as a Richmonder, I think, I don't think why now, I think why not before? How did we, I always knew there was this weird double consciousness, right? These were people who tried to destroy the United States. We considered ourselves more patriotic than other people, and yet, and so what starts to happen is, I think, a combination of things. You have this whole change, generational change, among a lot of people of color, that is expressed in a movement like Black Lives Matter, which is like, we're not about slow progress, right? This has got to stop. You got to stop shooting. You got to stop shooting Black teenagers. And then you had the massacre at
Charleston.
In Charleston, which was carried out by someone who's explicitly involved with this neo-Confederate ideology, and people began to realize we can't we can't run the enterprise. The wheels are going to come off because these people are not going to take it anymore. And we're seeing this uprising against the statues, and I think we're seeing the backlash in favor of the statues, precisely because our society is in the process, finally, of internalizing demographic change and internalizing that this can no longer be a whites on top society. Leave the morality aside, it won't work anymore because the population is diverse, and these are people who have political power, and they want change. And that provokes a lot of other people who I think, honestly, are not that involved with the Civil War, right? I mean, I give my constitutional law class a lecture about Pickett's charge, because I say that's the most important constitutional event in American history, the failure of Pickett's charge and the beginning of Black citizenship with the Battle of Battery Wagner 2 weeks later. And, I mean, I had ancestor who was taken prisoner at the Battle of the Crater. I had another one who was left for dead at Gettysburg and actually didn't die, and so I'm very involved in how tragic, and complex and contradictory and sad this whole event was. How many people died? How much of America was burned and destroyed by this war, right? But the people who are down there chanting, "You will not replace us," they're not there because of their ancestral memories of Pickett's charge, or the Battle of the Crater, or going to see General Butler to get their horse back. General Lee stands for whiteness, and a 60-foot General Lee, the one that you and I grew up near, he sends a message. This is a white man's country.
Yeah, it's interesting. After Charleston, we documented about 300 pro-Confederate flag rallies in the second half of 2015. They were concentrated in the South, but not limited to the South.
Absolutely not.
There were rallies in Oregon, where I know you taught. There are rallies in Washington. There are rallies in Pennsylvania. To me at least, they seemed like nothing more than expressions of whiteness. We're not going to be replaced.
Right.
Our lives matter too. Did you see it any differently?
I think that's absolutely right. I think that in a way, white Americans, many of them, have for generations preserved this idea of the Confederacy as the road not taken. Right? We lost. We being whites. And that I certainly ran in. I lived in Oregon for 16 years, and I ran into that there because the Oregon Trail was a trail out of the South. It came out of Missouri, and Southerners are the ones who settled Oregon, and they brought with them their folkways. And we were out there 2 weeks ago and went by a stable that had a big Confederate flag flying, and what it basically says is, the white republic, the white man's republic.
Yeah.
This is what America was supposed to be. We either can keep it that way, or we wish we could keep it that way.
I haven't been in Richmond. I haven't lived there for a while. And I know there was a very prominent African-American lawyer in the late 90s, Saad El-Amin, who was on the city council and talked about taking the monuments down. But really nothing came of it. Then I know after Charleston, immediately after Charleston, there was a call for them to come down. And it was interesting for me to hear what Terry McAuliffe said, the liberal Democrat governor of Virginia. I'll read it. He was opposed to taking the monuments down. He said, "It is part of our heritage. It's who we are in Virginia, and it's an important part of our heritage. The flag is different." And that notion of heritage, not hate, being expressed by a liberal Democrat. What do you make of that?
Well, as I say, I feel the pull of Southern heritage, as strongly as anybody. And when honestly, Richard, when I give my lecture on Pickett's charge and I show, Armistead's position going up and where Pickett, and I tell the people that Longstreet, who was to give the order to charge, he was ordered by General Lee to go forward and conduct the charge. he was so overcome because he knew these men were going to die. He knew it was a mistake. He was so overcome that he could not speak. He could not speak to give the order. He had to take his hat off and wave it. Yes, go ahead, go up the hill and die. And I sometimes, will literally break down in front of my class because it is painful. And these are, the people that died on Cemetery Ridge, were people that the families that I grew up with. I grew up with people named Lee and Tucker and Pickett and and so forth. So I get the heritage part of it, right? It is a history that Virginia lived through and that marked it and that can't be made to go away. But the honoring of it as a political construct, right? That's not inevitable. We have, wars and war deads all over the world where people don't insist that because these people died, everything they believed was right. And I think that it is always about the present. It is always also about the present. And what we're saying is, we are afraid of losing our place in the present. It is always terrifying. If you conceive yourself to have grown up on top of society, it is always terrifying to think that you are going to lose that place and you'll be at the mercy of people who were beneath you before. So, I don't know. I would say it's fear. I think the heritage part of it, to be honest, I think Governor McAuliffe, I think some of the politicians in Richmond who want to go slow with monuments, in part that's because they're an economic institution. People come to Richmond to see those statues. I mean, there's a lot of really crummy Confederate statues in little towns, between here and where I am and where you are. You've seen them. And if they come down, I don't think anybody would shed a tear for anything except symbolic reasons. But that equestrian statue of Lee, horrible as it is, it's a beautiful thing. It stands against the sky and the cut of his head and so forth. It just dominates that space and people come to see it. And then the question becomes, what will we replace it with? Or maybe nobody will come to see it anymore. And so you kind of want to say, well, there's a business thing here, but you don't want to say that. So you say it's heritage.
Yeah, go back 20 years for a second. I know they put up a statue to Arthur Ashe.
Yeah.
It was an effort, I guess, to integrate Monument Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's kind of bizarre. It's like if in Germany you had a statue of Hitler and you said, okay, look, we'll put up Angela Merkel next to her, next to him. Now it's all
Becker, he was a tennis player, I mean, Arthur Ashe was a great man, but it was a very odd choice.
Completely bizarre. And of course, today, Richmond is a predominantly African-American city, a majority Black city council, an African-American mayor, yet they are still struggling to come to terms and make a decision about this.
Yes.
Do you think it is just kind of economics? Do you think they're just worried about alienating, kind of the white minority there?
Well, I've talked to some of the officials down there now, and I'm actually very impressed by the kind of bind that they find themselves in. Part of it really is economic. And it's not simply that if you're the mayor or you're in the city government, you're sitting there thinking, how much will we lose? It's that you're getting calls from merchants. You're getting calls from, business people who depend on tourism who are saying, what are you going to do to us? This is going to be a real problem. And you need to pay attention to those people. A lot of jobs depend on them. And so that you're feeling that pressure. You also, I think, certainly Mayor Stoney and some of the other people who are in leadership now in Richmond, they take seriously the idea of inclusiveness. It's not just rhetoric. And what that means is that they listen to the people who come in and say, and you'd be surprised who some of these people are, white people who come in and say, if you do this, it will just destroy my sense of where I live and who I am, right? They're listening to that and they don't want to ride roughshod over them.
Personally, Garrett, and we just have a couple more minutes, how do you feel about it?
I'd be happy to see them go. I would be happy to see them go. But I said, and I've written about this, if we're not going to take them down and we want to contextualize it, think of all the history that Richmond could be celebrating, even stuff that literally happened on that very street. On that very street was where the Tallheimer sit-in was, one of the great sit-ins of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. On that street, Lincoln stood at the east end of that street and made a speech, the only speech he ever made, to freed slaves. He stood at the base of a statue of Washington and spoke to a group of freed slaves. There's no statue there commemorating that. We could have a statue depicting the entry into Richmond of the U.S. colored troops that liberated the city after Lee withdrew. And if we put that stuff in there, maybe it wouldn't seem so bad. And the other thing, of course, that you suggested was, I thought, was genius because it's so obvious once you think of it, is if we want to keep the Lee statue, fine, let's take him off the pedestal and bring him, so it's a 14-foot statue and not a 60. Let's change it, right? So that if people don't feel like we're bulldozing everything, the process of change, once it begins, if it's inclusive, can be very, very liberating to everybody.
Let me ask you two last questions before we go. I want you to comment on something Mr. Trump said. He said, so this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson is coming down. I wonder if it's George Washington next week and then Thomas Jefferson after that. What's the difference between, Jefferson and Washington are both slave owners. What's the difference?
Well, somebody said that to me, actually, an English person said, well, I suppose you'll do Washington next. And I said, I am unfamiliar with that part of history in which Washington fought to overthrow the United States and destroy its government. Could you inform me? But he, of course, being a good-natured fellow, he says, well, I quite take your point. And so, I think we can make the cutoff point at literal treason. We don't have a statue of Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was from someplace, but they don't have a monument to him there. He was a traitor. And under the definition of treason in our Constitution, these men were traitors. And it's fine. I don't mean we have to have days of hate, but you don't usually put up statues to traitors.
Yeah.
If we want to stop revering Thomas Jefferson quite as much as we do, that I'm willing to listen to that because the man had great contradictions. But he brought a lot more to the American table than Lee or Davis or Jackson or Stewart, A.P. Hill, any of these people ever did.
Yeah, let me ask you one last question. It was a line from one of the articles that you wrote. And take it beyond Richmond if you could. You said, this is not a fight over history. It is a fight over the future.
Yes.
How do you think it's going to end, Garrett?
Well, I don't know. I grew up like you and lived through as a young man and as a teenager. I lived through the civil rights era, and I saw society change and get better in ways that really seemed unimaginable. So I am, I have a character defect, which is that I'm an optimist. I'm an American optimist. I keep thinking that our idea, it's such a good idea that we will continue and we will build it and we will expand it. But at the same time, if you study Southern history and you study American history with open eyes, much as you love the country, you study the way our history really works, you realize it's not, progress in this country is not all in one direction. And, between things that seemed impossible, racial oppression that seemed unimaginable in 1890 was in place by 1910 because the country moved backwards so far and white public opinion turned against inclusion. And we have a president now who is explicitly calling for the restoration of the rule of white people exactly the way it was when we were young. That's all Joe Arpaio is. He's Jim Clark. He's Bull Connor. He is white man's law. And the president, it's not a coincidence that the president endorses him, that the president says, he endorses the Lee statues, that he says that these are very fine people. He is sending a message, and it is capable of enormous damage.
Yeah. Well, look, we've kept you too long. I really appreciate your time. It's great to talk to you. It's great to see you.
Yeah.
And your last words, I think, were really quite important. You know, right now we are in a struggle for the soul of our country. There are people out there who want our nation to be defined by race and ethnicity. And there are those, and I think you and I are on the same side here, who want it to be defined by its highest principles. We have a long way to go to make those principles a reality, a long way to go, but they're principles worth fighting for. And I think everyone at the Southern Poverty Law Center, all of our supporters, and hopefully everyone listening today are up for that fight and reject the vision of America that we saw in such ugly fashion in Charlottesville. So again, Garrett, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for all the work that you and the SPLC have done all these years. It makes me feel good about coming from Richmond to know that you're out there. So
thank you, Garrett. I really appreciate it.
all right, great.
So long, everybody.